Good morning and welcome to our webinar. We'll get started in just a few more minutes as everyone gets logged into the system. Welcome to our webinar. Good morning and welcome to our webinar. We'll get started in just another minute or two, so please bear with us as folks get logged into the system. Good morning and welcome to our webinar. My name is Melody Pazalt. I'm with the Healthcare Authority and I'm joined by Ashley Crider. We'll get started in just another minute or two as folks get logged into the system and get their audio controls all set up. Hopefully all of our audio sounds clear, so please let us know if you're having any difficulty hearing us. Thanks for who just raised their hand. It sounds like our audio is coming through clear, so thank you for that. So we'll get started in just another minute or two. It's okay to respond directly to you.
She did respond, but I responded again, and she hasn't responded again. Okay. So I'm not just doing it, so she responded again because
I want to be very mindful of time. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Melody Pazalt. I'm a section manager here at the Healthcare Authority in the Division of Behavioral Health and Recovery. And the Healthcare Authority and our partner agencies have been starting to meet internally. Our sister divisions have been starting to talk about all of the behavioral health intersections and interfaces with the individuals in the criminal justice system. And so we wanted to create a webinar series to inform, educate, and coordinate resources for individuals with mental health and substance use issues who have criminal justice involvement. This webinar series is intended for anyone interested in increasing their understanding of the criminal justice system, programs, services, and resources that promote recovery in the lives of people with behavioral health disabilities. Our webinar is being recorded today, and so we will be posting that on the Healthcare Authority website at some point. You will see on the menu that I have already uploaded a copy of the PowerPoint, and so you can download a copy of the presentation. If you're not familiar with the GoToWebinar menu, right now you're seeing a slide that kind of talks a little bit about the options for audio and if you have a question. So audio, I do always encourage people to dial in. The audio tends to be clear on the telephone, and so there is a dial-in option. If you click on the menu, use the little caret at the side that has audio, and you'll have a choice of either calling in via telephone or listening over the speakers in your microphone, over your computer. If you have a question, I do encourage you to type it into the chat box or the question box, and we'll be addressing questions at the end. Again, this video or this webinar is being recorded, and we will have that posted available later on, and a copy of the handouts are already uploaded onto the GoToWebinar. So with that, I'm going to be turning it over to Ashley from Policy Research Associates. Ashley, I've known Ashley for many years in several different capacities, and she's just a fantastic resource and soon to be a Washingtonian. As she'll be moving out here from New York, and so we're so excited to have her in our state. But Ashley is a senior project associate and coordinates training and technical assistance to the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Safety and Justice Challenge, providing support to local leaders across the country to address over-incarceration in jails with a focus on individuals with behavioral health disorders. She's part of PRA's work with the True Blood Competency Evaluation and Restoration Settlement in Washington State, providing technical assistance and strategic planning around the implementation of the state's diversion services plan and court compliance priorities, and working with high utilizer sites to implement diversion and reentry programs. She previously focused on SAMHSA's GAIN Center for Behavioral Health and Justice Transformation, coordinating the national solicitation and delivery of criminal justice and trauma-related trainings, facilitating the Sequential Intercept mapping workshops, as well as providing training and technical assistance to SAMHSA's 7 supported employment program grantees. That's where I know her from. Developing their capacity to implement evidence-based supported employment statewide. We are doing that in Washington through our Foundational Community Support Program. I was just telling Ashley about the great outcomes that we are seeing so far in our FCS program. But that's another webinar that's actually happening later in February. So happy to share more information about our FCS program. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Ashley to share information about the Sequential Intercept model.
Thanks, Melody. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Ashley Crider. I'm going to give a little bit of background on Policy Research Associates and why you're listening to me. We have been around since 1987. We're a women-owned small business based just outside of Albany, New York, so upstate New York. And as Melody said, I am finally cashing in on a longer-term plan to move out to the Pacific Northwest, so very excited about that. PRA has several different technical assistance centers that you may have heard of. We operate SAMHSA's GAIN Center, and we also do work around veterans and their families. We operate the SOAR National Technical Assistance Center around getting folks on access to benefits. We do a lot of work around youth and the juvenile justice system as well. But my focus here has primarily been on the adult criminal justice system and the interaction with behavioral health for a little over 7 years. I have a couple of bullets on the screen as far as work that we've done with Washington State, or that I've done with Washington State while at PRA. So Melody mentioned these first 2 bullets, a supportive housing and supported employment programs through SAMHSA. That's, as she said, where we met first. Also, there are 2 sites within the state that are part of the MacArthur Foundation Safety and Justice Challenge. that she mentioned already, and that's all focused on reducing over-incarceration in jails. So looking at different points of diversion. And then most recently, I was part of our technical assistance and strategic planning around the competency process in Washington State, so around the True Blood diversion services, and we held a statewide summit last September in Seattle. So thrilled to have another connection today to Washington. Just quickly, there's a lot of information I'm going to cover this morning, so I may speak a little bit quickly, but it's being recorded, so that's great. I wanted to talk about kind of the focus population of the SIM, the sequential intercept model, a little bit about the importance of collaboration between justice and behavioral health stakeholders, kind of an overview, background of the model, some key elements at each of the intercept points, which I'll define in just a moment. And then also talk a little bit about what the SIM workshop looks like. So we have the model, and then we have the workshop process, as well as obviously what's next, and we'll have some time at the end for questions. So first of all, what is the population that we're talking about? A little bit of background. Again, most of my work has been on the adult criminal justice side, and commonly the interaction with behavioral health, kind of the overlap there. So both substance use disorders and mental health systems. So for the purpose of today and this sequential intercept model, we're looking at the adult side. PRA also does a similar mapping process with juvenile justice that touches on school-based systems, education, school-to-prison pipeline, all of those things, but most of my work, again, has been on the adult side. So we're talking about folks with serious mental illness, as well as other mental health issues that quite often have co-occurring substance use disorders and are either already involved with the criminal justice system or are at risk of involvement, and I'll differentiate there in just a moment. So what are the numbers here? We know based on data that about 4% of the general population, so everyone, has a serious mental illness. And I want to be clear that when we're talking about serious mental illness or SMI, this is not including every mental health diagnosis, every mental illness, but it's specifically looking at three kind of sets of higher acuity mental illnesses. So it's talking about schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, and major depression. So you can imagine that if we include more than those groups of SMI, that number would jump up quite a bit. But for the purpose of this, we're just looking at serious mental illness. When we move into the criminal justice system, we know that that number jumps way up. So about 17% of folks in jail have the serious mental illness, so about 13% higher than the general population. And then going a step further, about 72% of folks in jail with the serious mental illness also have a co-occurring substance use disorder. And this information was a study that we did across 4 jails. So all of that to summarize that 1 in 6 people roughly are coming into jail with a serious mental illness. If you think about maybe a different type of health, physical illness, if we had 1 in 6 people coming into jail with heart disease, there would be a lot of action and advocacy around doing something about that. So thinking about it more in the physical health realm, I think really makes those numbers jump out. We also like to kind of flip it and look at it from the substance use disorder perspective first. So we know that about 80% of people that were arrested tested positive for a drug. Obviously, this doesn't mean that they necessarily have a substance use disorder, but the presence of some drug in their system. Looking at substance use disorders, we have about 63% of folks that are in jail that do have SUD. 22% of those also have a co-occurring mental illness. And then we know that only 1 in 5 inmates receive drug treatment while they're incarcerated. So a very small percentage. That is not to blame the jails or to say that administration doesn't care, but we know that jails just do not have the capacity to treat the level of behavioral health needs that we see in jails. The other, kind of the third piece to this is trauma. So this is probably familiar to many of the folks on the phone. This is a 5-year study that we did of a jail diversion program to look at trauma and folks that are involved in the justice system. So this study specifically was only looking at physical or sexual abuse. Obviously, trauma includes a much wider lens, and the sample was about 2,000 folks. We had 2 things really stand out from this study. One was that the rates of self-reported trauma, again, physical or sexual abuse, for people in this program were pretty similar between men and women, which is, not necessarily traditionally always thought of, or more, probably less and less now a surprise, but at least historically that was not thought of to be the case. And the other thing is that the rate of reported trauma within one's lifetime and currently, which was defined as the last 12 months, those rates are pretty similar as well. So all of this to say that we know that many of the people that we're coming in contact with in our work on a daily basis are currently experiencing pretty severe trauma or have experienced it at some point in their lifetime. So in a lot of the work that we do, and we have a separate trauma training, we talk about a universal assumption of trauma, not necessarily to excuse people's behavior, but to offer a little bit of a different lens as far as looking at folks that we come in contact with in the justice system. So that's a little bit of background as far as the target population. One thing that is really woven throughout the sequential intercept model and the workshop is the importance of collaboration between the justice side and behavioral health and community. We know that that is not always easy or probably ever easy. It includes things like cross-training between the different agencies and organizations, formal interagency agreements to do things like data sharing, and as well as formalized task forces or bodies that are a compilation of cross-systems groups. And there are a lot of challenges here. So obviously funding is often in a siloed manner. Is not always easy to spread between criminal justice and behavioral health in particular. Obviously these systems have different cultures, different ways of speaking, and resources are limited generally across all of this. So very important, not always easy. And I just want to throw this slide in to mention that when we talk about work group or cross-systems task force and collaboration, these are some of the things that we're talking about. So obviously professionals, that's pretty obvious, family members and advocates, but including the voices of people with lived experiences or peers. And that's something that we've worked with Melody on for years, really, in the different programs, and I know is important to the different stakeholders in Washington State. It is of utmost importance from our perspective that people with lived experience are included whenever possible at every level of decision-making and program implementation and evaluation and all of those things. So this is really important to us, and we promote this a lot during the SIM workshop and process. We've already talked about the orange bubbles you see there. This is a cross-systems group, ideally including all those pieces. But then also the two levels towards the bottom. So this references a little bit Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we know that if someone is not sure where they're going to spend the night or where they're going to get their next meal, it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, for them to work on their recovery, for an example. So it's important that folks from these different pieces are included in your task forces and work groups and the different initiatives that you're doing. So I want to talk a little bit about the SIM model itself and kind of what it looks like and the history. It was developed in the early 2000s by Drs. Patty Griffin and Mark Munitz. They are forensic psychologists and forensic psychiatrists, and it was first tested in Summit County, Ohio, and Southeast Pennsylvania. So the kind of the crux of the SIM model is that people move through the criminal justice system in at least semi-predictable ways. So we know that it's not exactly linear and might vary, but generally there's a kind of a common process. So in looking at that process, we can identify key points or intercepts, as we call them in this model, to do some of the things you see listed here. So to link folks into treatment, divert them out of the justice system, and when they are in the justice system, increase case processing, make it more efficient, and then also increase community tenure and engagement with services and treatment and other resources. So we're looking for a better way so that people, especially with behavioral health needs, don't get stuck in the justice system. If you're interested in learning more about the model and the background, that was first published in a psychiatric services article in 2006. You can see that cover here. And then there was a more recent book by the authors. So this is the first glimpse of, if you haven't seen it already, the sequential intercept model. It looks very linear here, which again, we know is not always the case, but it lets you see in a really visual format where there might be off-ramps for folks that are inappropriate to be in the justice system. So that could be at arrest, at pretrial, sentencing, the different intercept points for diversion. And when we do this sequential intercept mapping workshop, the focus is typically across all of these intercepts, so looking at, kind of start to finish, although I'm putting that in quotes here. I think this looks more like a circle if you could connect Intercept 0 and 5. But we do also do mappings that are focused and tailored to a specific intercept or issue. So we often do early intercept mappings, looking at 0 and 1 in particular, or mappings that are focused on substance use and opioids, things like that. So generally it's all of this, but not always. This is an older model. If you want to look at it a little bit differently, depending on how your brain works, it used to be more of a funnel, if you picture this as 3D. So that was prior to the linear model. So you can see that Intercept 0 at the top is ideally where we'll touch a lot more folks, and then as we go further through the justice system, hopefully that funnel becomes a little bit smaller. We have done several SIM workshops in Washington State. I've listed them up here, and there also may be cities and counties that have kind of gone through this process on their own. We see that across the country as well, but we've come on site, as you can see, several times and worked with counties in Washington. Generally, the mapping is done at the county level, sometimes with cities, especially larger cities like LA and Chicago, but most commonly at the county level. And we also do statewide criminal justice behavioral health summits that are not a mapping process. Obviously, that's a much bigger system, but it talks a lot about the different issues here, and we're able to touch on a lot of these issues and intercepts, but from a larger statewide level. So I'm going to walk through just a few key elements in each intercept and get a little bit detailed, more detailed. We cover these, as you can imagine, in a lot more detail during the workshop, but I want to be sensitive to time here. So Intercept 0 is actually our newest intercept. We incorporated that formally in the fall of 2017, and up to then it was only Intercepts 1 through 5. And actually there's kind of an ongoing argument for Intercept -1, which would look at school systems, poverty, a lot of larger systemic issues. But Intercept 0 was really developed because we wanted to draw attention to the fact that people shouldn't have to contact law enforcement to receive community services, whether they're in a crisis or otherwise. So we know that the crisis kind of Intercept 0 piece contains a lot of players. So this is an example of some of those different services and programs that you can see within this crisis to stabilization or crisis to recovery continuum. I won't go into detail. Probably folks are familiar with a lot of these, but they look differently depending on the community that you're in. They have different purposes, timelines, lengths of stay, things like that. But the main point here is, do people know how to access these services without having to call 911, which often results in law enforcement response. So we're looking at services that are pre-crisis or more preventative, obviously during a crisis, whether that rises to an emergency level or not, and then also post-crisis. So again, kind of a circular thing. The overlap between Intercept 0 and 1 is really because we recognize that law enforcement has a dual role here. So some of that is outlined in this guide that you can see. And I want to also point out that anytime you see a resource that looks like a cover page on the slides, it's able to be downloaded online for free. So you can search any of these after the webinar and get some more resources. So this really defined the dual role of law enforcement as also a legal protector, not only the enforcer of public safety, but also responding to those that aren't able to care for themselves. And we know that it's not always the case that law enforcement responds to a situation in response to criminal behavior, but sometimes and often people call 911 first, and law enforcement is the first responder on scene. One of the things we talk about at the SIM workshops is asking law enforcement who went into this business or this line of work because you wanted to be the first person on site when someone's having a mental health crisis. I mean, usually no one raises their hand. So recognizing that law enforcement is often the first on the scene in a lot of these situations, but that they may not have the training in some cases or the expertise to know what to do, and there also may not be enough community support and alternatives for diversion. So we'll get into that in just a second. So Intercept 1, and you'll see that Intercept 0 and 1 kind of bleed back and forth. There are, when you see the map in its entirety, there are arrows that go back and forth. This is recognizing that often, sometimes contact with law enforcement is unavoidable. So we're looking at things like divert to what? Law enforcement can have all of the goodwill and the attempts to divert folks that shouldn't be in the justice system, but they need to have alternatives where they know that people are safe and they know where they are. So one of the things that we talk about here is the 911 and dispatch level, what kind of training they've had around mental illness, if they have a formal script as far as asking those questions. There is crisis intervention team training for dispatch workers, as well as corrections staff. So we will talk about that most commonly when we're talking about law enforcement. There's also CIT training for dispatch. Is that being used? If so, is there linkage to CIT officers in particular when someone with a mental health need calls? Does the dispatcher have the ability to transfer a call to a crisis line if it doesn't rise to an acute emergency level? In some locations, they can transfer back to 911 if needed. We see this in Harris County, Texas, and across the country. This is becoming more common. And then the information sharing piece. So is there HIPAA protected, but is there mental health information transferred to law enforcement so that they have information that they need when they go on site? You can see a sample here of some of the common law enforcement response models concerning behavioral health. We talked about CIT, which is a 40-hour training that is very linked into the community and support at that level. Co-responder models are very common across the country. We do a lot of work with that model, as well as mobile mental health teams that don't co-respond with law enforcement, but that they can travel on their own or respond later or do proactive work, things like that. Also off-site support, so things like telehealth, using phone or video systems, especially in rural areas, that's becoming more and more common. And then other specialized response that is either corresponding with law enforcement or in its own capacity. So ambulance, EMS, fire departments in many cases, these are all different elements within Intercept 1. And again, it's important to keep in mind that we need to pair both of these things. So both law enforcement response and diversion, and then the community capacity to support. So when we're looking for real systemic change, both of these pieces are really imperative. And when we're talking about how to support law enforcement in diversion at Intercept 0 and 1, we're talking about things like a centralized drop-off point where officers are able to get back to the field quickly, a no refusal policy, linkage to community services, all of these things. So that's answering that divert to what question. So moving into Intercept Queue, so we're formally in the justice system now. This is generally a pretty short time period, so a lot of communities overlook it as far as opportunities for diversion, but there are some key things that can happen here. We use the term first court appearance, but that is also called magistrate or arraignment in different communities. We know that this intercept point, this time period, is really key. So there's one study up here by the Arnold Foundation that illustrates that. We know that when people that are low risk, so we're going to start talking a little bit about risk, and that's risk of failure to appear and risk of recidivism or committing new crimes. When people that are low risk are held for 2 to 3 days, they're 40% more likely to commit new crimes before trial. So only holding them in jail a couple of days really impacts that risk. When they're held 8 to 14 days, low-risk folks are 51% more likely to commit crimes up to 2 years after case disposition. So all of this to say that we know that there is a significant population of people that are in jail awaiting trial that are low or medium risk. The National Association of Counties did a survey in 2013, and they put that number at about 60% of folks. So these are people that could be successfully managed and supervised within the community for a lot of reasons, but also because we know that holding them in jail for even a couple of days really increases those negative outcomes. There are a lot of different points within that Intercept model, within the justice system, where we can do identification, screening, and referral. So obviously, law enforcement observations from the field, that initial contact is really key, but you can see a lot of different players and points in the system here to help identify who is appropriate and inappropriate to be in jail and prison, and otherwise link folks out. So this is just to say that everyone really has a role in determining, is jail an appropriate place for this person? And we do that through screening, different levels, screening, assessment, and evaluation, but screening is really that quick initial flag for, does this person need further follow-up and assessment? So these are different domains that it's really important to look at, especially within Intercepts 2 and 3. Mental health, substance abuse, suicide risk is probably the one that's done in most communities, even if nothing else is done. But also, do communities have safety plans in place if someone does flag at risk for a suicide? Also, traumatic brain injury screening and screening for intellectual developmental disabilities. These things really impact, obviously, people's brains and ability to reason and make cognitive decisions about recovery and other things. So this is something that's, I think, often overlooked in communities, as well as screening for veteran status. And there are a lot of issues that go along with that, like what kind of language are you using to ask that question, but these are all things that are really important to be working towards at Intercept 2. So Intercept 3, this is jail and prison. As well as the court system. So we're looking at pretrial detention, dispositional courts, as well as specialty courts or treatment courts, problem-solving courts. They have different names across the country. So some key elements here are what services are available in jail and what screening is done, what assessments, do people have access to medication? Is it the same medication that they may have been taking when they were in the community prior to incarceration, or is there a limited formulary? Are there any mental health substance use services provided within the jail? What's the criteria for those? Is there gender-specific services, trauma-informed services, things like that? Medication-assisted treatment, or MAT, is really huge. Probably most of the folks on the phone are familiar or have heard that being bounced around. There are a few communities now that have had settlements as far as jails needing to provide MAT if the person was taking it prior to incarceration. So that's pairing behavioral therapy with medication, typically around substance use and often opioids. So MAT is a big one, and different levels of MAT, what's available within jail or not. Also, communication with providers in the community. Is any of that happening? Is there in-reach from providers into the jail to do services or to work with discharge planning and reentry, things like that? And then on the treatment court side, you can see a bunch of different options listed here. And we know we have some data on the numbers across the country. This is from the National Association of Drug Court Professionals. And all of these data are from 2016, with the exception of mental health court, and that's from 2018. So we know that there are about 3,100 drug courts across the country, and a little more than half of those are adult drug courts. So by far the most prevalent, we have the most data around drug courts and their effectiveness, but there are a lot of other different options that may be right depending on the community, and others that aren't listed up here as well. So when we're looking at Intercept 3, there are a few different kind of points where criminal charges can be used as treatment leverage, again in quotes, leverage here. So pre-plea, this is when there's diversion to whatever the service is in lieu of further case processing. So that kind of halts the criminal side. Post-plea, this is really common, so there's a deferred or modified sentence, often to a specialty court or a treatment court, and then also probation-based. So here there would be a conviction, but treatment is a term of probation, so a little bit lighter on that side. And a lot of treatment courts are this post-plea model, but there is an opportunity for pre-plea interventions, and that's something that should be considered. Intercept 4. So now we're starting to loop around that circle, and we're talking about reentry, both from jail and prison. We know that this is really important because 95% of people do return to the community. So people are getting out. They're coming back into the communities, and are they better off and more equipped to work on recovery, find employment, things like that, or are they worse off? This is also, in addition to just the numbers, this is an important intercept because of a lot of data, but this study in particular from Washington State, which we talk about all over the place when we do this workshop, this shows really how critical this time period is. So there was a study of 30,000 people released from prison. This was in 2007. We know that 443 died during just under 2 years following reentry. And then that number by itself doesn't tell you a whole lot, but we know that death rate was 3.5 times higher than the general population, so in the first 2 years. And in the first week after release, that number was 17 times the general population. So much, much higher, a big jump there. You can probably guess that a lot of that was related to drug overdose, people with a much lower tolerance coming out of prison that then were involved with drug use and had an overdose, unfortunately. And there's a few other causes here as well. So we also know that as much as we hear about suicide while in jail, and those numbers have risen, post-release death by suicide is actually 3 times higher than in-jail death. Because again, we're releasing folks possibly to the same types of triggers and stressors and situations that they had prior to incarceration, but potentially without much support or capacity to deal with those. So suicide rate soon after reentry is also really important to look at. So reentry, those are some of the unfortunate numbers, but what can we do about that? So we know that ideally a reentry process begins really early on. So there's some luxury here as far as knowing folks' discharge dates. Sometimes people are released at court. We might not know the date or time, so this isn't always possible, but that speaks to the importance of beginning the reentry process as early as we can. Also, a really key thing here is sorting the population based on risk and need. And folks may be familiar with the risk-need responsivity model. I'll talk about that in Intercept 5. But it's important to look at the different, again, risk levels of people in the jail and prison and link them to supervision and to services based on those. So we have a note here, focus on medium to high risk people, and that is because a lot of people that are lower risk will volunteer for programming and will self-refer to them. So one of the things when we're talking about sorting, knowing who your population is obviously using some sort of screening tool like we talked about earlier. It's important that the tool is validated, which means that the tool is doing what it says it's doing, basically. So the tool has been tested on a group. We know that it is giving correct answers in a majority of percentages to the questions that we're asking. We're not just kind of guessing whether it's accurate or not. So using a validated tool for screening for needs, and then also some kind of checklist for transitional needs, and I'll show you an example in just a second. And then another thing to keep in mind is that needs change. So you can imagine that what someone being released from jail or prison needs in the first 24 hours may differ from the first week, 3 months, 9 months, and extending farther out. So recognizing that needs are not a one point in time thing, but that there needs to be some planning for time that's farther out as well. There are different reentry models, although we'll argue whether the last one is a model. But so referring out, so this is a reentry model where well, these are really what it sounds like. So staff in the jail or prison are giving referrals to community services, whether that is just a business card, whether that is calling to set up an appointment, transportation potentially. There are different levels and qualities here, but generally the referral out is as it sounds. Reach in is kind of the opposite of that, where there is in-reach from community providers into the jail or prison prior to release, obviously, and there's some linkages made there. Transitional reentry is really the highlighted model that we promote the most, and that's a combination of refer out and reach in. So that's where you have staff from both the justice system and the community doing work to create what we call a warm handoff in linking people to services. And then finally, $40 on a bus ticket is really not a model, but unfortunately what we see in some communities, especially those that are resource poor, there was an instance of a mapping that we did in an urban area in a southern state, and they were seeing a lot of kind of this hub of needs around the bus station because people were being sent there from after they were released from other communities with the hopes that they would find employment and things like that, but it was really creating this hub of needs. So we mentioned a checklist looking at needs. This is one that we developed internally, but we talk about it because it's free and we think it's useful, but there's certainly a lot of different models that you can use here. This is really just a survey of folks' potential needs, and it looks at different domains. As you can see the screen, it talks about mental health, housing, healthcare, substance use, really physical, practical needs. And this one in particular is based on the APIC model, which is has 4 sets of tasks that are outlined for kind of an ideal transition planning process. But it's really just there to help jails and prisons in their reentry work, even if you don't have a lot of time to dedicate to that. This is something that can be used pretty simply. It identifies the needs there, and then also you can look at the steps taken to address them. So referral to services, things like that. Housing here. This could probably be discussed at a lot of the intercepts, but we want to draw attention to it in particular. Obviously, a huge need at Intercept 4 and Reentry, but similar to the crisis services piece, when we're talking about housing, we're ideally talking about a continuum. So this is another resource. You can see the cover here on the screen. But everything from emergency shelters, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing. We know Washington State has done a lot of that on transitional services, and then moving up the permanency ladder, ideally towards affordable rentals and home ownership. So if you're looking at the different housing services in the community, it's important to kind of do an inventory of the different levels, as well as a lot of other things like criteria. So finally, Intercept 5. This is where we have 2 sets of arrows, as you can see, both those black arrows extending back out into the community, and then the red arrows, which signify a violation of probation and parole, which would then go back into the system. This intercept is, I think I'm saying all the intercepts are important, but this one is really key because of just the amount of folks that are under correctional supervision. So when we're talking about corrections, we think about jail and prison, I think a lot, but we have 67% of folks here that are on probation or parole, so a huge amount of people. Specialized caseloads is one of the things that we talk about during the SIM workshop at this intercept. Those are dedicated teams ideally, but in some areas where there are less resources, maybe it's just a probation officer that has specialized training in a certain area and has a caseload of folks that are impacted by that. So we talk a lot about mental health caseload, possibly substance use, DWI, domestic violence, sometimes sex offenders. So different jurisdictions have different officers and teams that have these specialized caseloads. Usually those have lower numbers of folks than a general caseload, and they really take an individualized approach to improving linkage and, again, tenure in services, and there are documented benefits to using the specialized caseloads, and you can see some of them up here. I mentioned the risk need responsivity model, and I want to go into a little bit of detail on that. since you probably heard me say individualized or specialized a few times. So this model identifies kind of 4 quadrants that you can see on the right side of the screen as far as risk and need. So this is based on research from 2 researchers that looked at a lot of data and identified these central 8 risk factors for recidivism or committing new crimes. So these are things that are associated with recidivism in the future. So you can see that they're further divided into the big 4, which are most predictive of future recidivism, and then the moderate 4, which are still associated with risk, but a little bit less so. And you'll notice that some of these things are dynamic. So some things can be changed, whereas others, such as childhood, are not. So those are static. So some of the things under moderate 4 are also potentially protective factors if some of these elements are in place in somebody's life. And so all of this to say that you can read a lot more about this model if you'd like to, but all of this to say that looking at people's individual risk and needs should really drive selection of what services and programs they're put into, but also what types of supervision are used. And there's a lot of data behind that this approach works well. So there are different strategies as far as where someone might fall within those 4 quadrants. So all of that was a really quick summary of the different intercepts, 6 intercepts, and kind of what we talk about within each. We go, again, into a lot more detail during the workshop, but I wanted to give you a little bit more background as far as what the workshop looks like. So we have some additional discussion around collaboration. We also talk about examples of collaboration at the jurisdiction's local level. So there are usually examples of justice and behavioral health collaboration already that has led to having a SIM workshop. And those, we kind of highlight those and see what is the background that led to us coming on site and doing this workshop. We actually map the local system. So I'll skip ahead so you can see an example here. The photo on the left is what a site's local map looks like originally. So we do this, there are usually 2 facilitators. Someone is asking the questions, facilitating the conversation with the group that's there. We're pretty prescriptive about who should be in the room for this. Obviously, people that represent all of these intercept points, as well as the community services. And a couple of key things there are people that are decision makers and have leadership and can move some of these priorities forward, but also including people that are really that frontline, boots on the ground group to give that input. So you're probably unimpressed with the look of this picture. It's pretty messy when we leave a community, but we bring that back to our office. It gets transcribed electronically, cleaned up, and it's a much better comprehensive visual picture of what a SIM looks like in a specific community. So that's the mapping process. Through that, we talk about gaps and resources at each intercept. So what are the things that a site already has in place? Those might be programs, people, policies. What are the resources there that can be maximized and connected together? And then also, where are the gaps? So there is probably a reason that we were brought in to do this inventory, this mapping, but we talk about what are the gaps at each intercept, and then those are used to draft a list of priorities for change. So this, you can see that an example on the right picture there. These are gaps that really rise to the top as far as what does the community want to work on during the remainder of the mapping. And these are usually a day-and-a-half workshops. So these are gaps that are timely, are important, and that we have the right people in the room to tackle them a little bit. So sometimes there are gaps that come up that don't make this list to do some targeted work on during the mapping, and there could be a variety of reasons for that. Maybe the right people aren't in the room, or they're just too large to tackle, or they're influenced by legislation. There could be a lot of different reasons for that. So after we identify that list of priorities, that's probably around 12 to 15 gaps, we have a voting process. So everyone in the room has 3 votes. They come up and put them on different priorities for change, and then after that, we're left with a ranked list of top priorities or top gaps to work on. And I want to mention that all of this information, while we end up focusing on just a few priorities, all of it gets included in a report that goes to the site, all the list of gaps, resources, really all of the discussion from the day and a half. So when we have that ranked list of priorities, we use those to develop what we want to do in action planning. When I say we, I really mean the group that's in the room. All of the information and kind of where we want to go comes from the folks that are in the room. And that's why we're pretty prescriptive about who should be invited and who should be there, so we don't have any of those missing pieces. So we will, based on the ranked list of priorities, we'll make a couple of decisions as far as a few priorities to focus on during that second half day, and we'll do some action planning. So we will move into smaller groups and do some pretty practical strategic planning as far as what are those priorities, what are some action steps that we can break down within them, who is responsible for moving some of these things forward, are there timelines attached to them, things like that. So by the end of the day and a half, the site has a pretty concrete set of steps to move forward, as well as a record of all of the discussion and working within the last day and a half. I will show you a sample mapping. So this is after it's obviously been cleaned up and a lot of the information checked, streamlined, things like that. This is an example out of Pierce County, Washington, actually, that we did pretty recently. So you can see that it looks a little bit different from the messy copy, but there's a lot in here. Sometimes or often some intercepts are more robust than others, depending on where we are and what has been the important initiatives that a community has focused on so far. But you can see that the arrows kind of show the flow of how someone might go through the system. And then we can see community both at the start and end. So again, if this is a piece of paper and you wrapped it till the edges touched each other, it would look like a circle, or in some cases negatively, in a revolving door. So what then? After a site, you'll submit some feedback and we go over edits and potential corrections to all of the materials. We have a final copy that has a lot of resources and as well as some set of facilitator recommendations for next steps. These are really all meant to be living documents. So the SIM model and workshop process is not meant to be something else that gets filed on a shelf and collects dust with other reports, but it's really meant to be something that communities can revisit and continue to use to guide their planning around these different initiatives. There are a lot of communities that update the map yearly on their own after we do this. So they're really meant, again, to be useful in ongoing work. So some of the things that we recommend sites do following the mapping, and we have actually a website developed with more resources I'll show you in just a second, is to fill in the missing information that might have resulted from people, all of the stakeholders not being in the room or things like that. So fill in the information that was missing during the on-site event, update timelines, things like that. We recognize that while these are ideally living documents, a community's priorities might shift. So that might be due to funding or administration or different things. But this is meant to be flexible. So a map is probably more or less accurate as time goes on, although different programs might come in and out. But the list of priorities and action plan may very well change, and that's fine. So this process is meant to be kind of a model to see how sites can begin to collaborate or continue collaborating, but recognizing that just because something was ranked as #1 priority during the SIM, it doesn't mean that it can't change, and that's totally fine. So again, with the kind of what's next follows who is going to be responsible for this. So is there a group, a national group, or a criminal justice coordinating committee, something like that that can absorb follow-up, whether that's updating the map, moving these priorities and action steps forward, where is this work going to fall? And that's something we try to identify before we leave at the workshop, but sometimes that's not always the case. So thinking about where it will fit. Also, continuing to build on the collaboration for folks that were present at the SIM. I probably always missing stakeholders, including that peer voice again. Are there local officials or champions that can be a part of this? That's something else that's important to think about as far as next steps after the workshop. And then also, importantly, integrating with other national initiatives that a community might have. So one of those that I work on directly is the MacArthur Safety and Justice Challenge. Also IACP's One Mind campaign. Stepping Up is probably very familiar to folks. The Data-Driven Justice Initiative. There are a lot of national initiatives that most of the communities we go to has touched one or more. So thinking about how to make sure those things aren't siloed, but that the work is really collaborative and integrated with each other. So I will pause there and pull up the chat box, see if I can see. I think Melody might have to point any questions towards me. I don't think I can see them, but feel free to type them into the. Yep.
Thank you so much, Ashley. We do have quite a number of questions that have been coming in. Can you hear me?
Yep.
So we do have quite a number of questions that have been coming in, and so no worries. Kyle asked the first question, and it kind of goes back to some of your earlier slides about some of the statistics. Is the population nationwide, or was it for the state? And if there's any citations for some of the study figures, and if you could share those.
Sure. I'm not sure which study you were referencing, Kyle. If it's the jail, the mental health and substance use numbers, those are national. But in either case, I can compile kind of a list of the citations and send it to Melody so it can be posted with this other stuff. Sure.
Richard asks, is there any software to help manage a SIM in a community?
That's a good question. I'm not aware of software for the SIM process itself. A lot of communities are using software to do things like data sharing between the justice system and behavioral health side, often focused around folks that are high utilizers or familiar faces, and touching a lot of these different pieces often. So there is some technology overlay in a lot of these issues, but I'm not aware of something that's being used for the SIM mapping. But I would love to hear about it.
Jim asks, do you have any figures on the effectivity of using criminal charges as a way to incentivize and work improvement programs? Oh, to incentivize work and improvement programs?
So we don't do any direct services at PRA, but we're often kind of the go-between between a direct service provider and then a funder, and providing technical assistance and things like that. So I don't have any data on that specifically. And I think there are a lot of different opportunities for diversion when we're talking about the justice system, but also we need to be careful that the expectations we're putting on folks are reasonable. Again, kind of speaking to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if somebody doesn't know where they're going to spend the night or what they're going to eat or something like that, it's probably not realistic to ask them to go to treatment, every day at noon or something like that, or if they're trying to keep their employment. So it's important, again, that we take kind of an individualized approach to what folks' needs are, and versus mandating kind of a blanket criminal justice response.
Thank you. Dina asked if they can get a copy of the checklist. I think the Reentry checklist screening tool, the warm handoff tool.
Sure. Yep, absolutely. I'll include that too.
Melissa, my friend down in Southwest Washington in Cowlitz, asked, how does one go about getting a SIM workshop in their community? What is the cost and who typically shares in that?
Oh, well, that would have been helpful information, huh? So we provide the SIM workshops through a few different venues. One is as technical assistance to grantees. So that's where our work with the MacArthur Foundation comes in. We have funding to provide technical assistance to sites, and this is commonly one of the things that we do. We also have it available as a fee-for-service workshop, and I can, if you want to email me, my information is up there. I can get you the exact quote. It varies a little bit depending on, you know, where in the country it is and things like that. That's something if you have funding to do it. And then also we have a national solicitation every year that unfortunately just closed this year. But we have funding through SAMHSA's Game Center to provide it to 8 to 10 communities for free. So we come on site and do that. It's a competitive solicitation process, but it's a pretty simple application. And if you email me or you go on our website and sign up for the Games e-newsletter, you'll be notified when that solicitation is coming out and hopefully can get one of these for free.
We have a couple of questions about how to access that, so that's great information. Rachel asked, how does a state usually connect with you and begin initial discussions and champion the process of SIM? Is it through the Department of Health, Medicaid agency, hospital association? I think it's all of those. I know certainly for the Healthcare Authority, our connection has been because of the True Blood lawsuit. And so I think there's several different ways, but is there other ways that other states have done that, Ashley?
Yeah, you're right, Melody. It could be all of those or any of those. Sometimes it depends on what the organization is that's kind of leading a lot of this work already. Sometimes it depends on where there is funding, if it's a fee-for-service event. So it can be, you know, we've worked with all of those groups, and it kind of depends on what the local picture is as far as how they would get linked in. But anyone can contact us, and we'll start that process and give you more information.
And last but not least, I want to be mindful of time. We have 1 minute left, and Ashley asked, Alicia asked, we work specifically with transition age youth population. Are you aware of research along these lines specific to the adolescent and young adult population?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they can kind of get stuck in the middle between the juvenile side, obviously, as you know, and the adult side. We do some work around transition age youth as part of this process if it's a larger issue within that community. So we have some resources. Again, if you want to email me, I can send you some resources specifically. And if there are other questions that we didn't have time to get to, feel free to email me, or if Melody can compile a list, I'm happy to answer those through email also.
Ashley, thank you so much for your time today. We so greatly appreciate it, and we look forward to you becoming a Washingtonian in a couple of weeks and having what a tremendous resource in Washington. So, Ashley, thank you so much. What a great presentation. Thank you to everyone who was able to join today. Again, we have recorded this webinar, and we'll be posting it on the Healthcare Authority website soon. And again, the handouts should be available to download even after, and we'll post those along with that. So thank you all so much. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.